Thanks, Wendy, and good afternoon, everyone. A few comments from me to try to set the stage. By way of introduction, I'm a generalist, and I know there are people here who are education specialists, and I know there are people here who are humanitarian specialists, and some who are both. My perspective does come as a generalist in this field, but just to note, I did start 30 years ago as a teacher. I taught math and physics in a rural high school in what was then Zaire. And I have to say, it gives me great pleasure to come back and talk about the subject of education. And it gave me great pleasure to see some of the work that Save the Children does around the world in the midst of humanitarian crises in Eastern Congo and other places where we're rebuilding schools and training teachers and putting kids back in class. What I wanted to talk about briefly is the overall scale and neglect of education in emergencies, and then to make 5 points about why I think education in emergencies is a critical topic that deserves our attention and deserves our funding and deserves our expertise. We know that in 2009 alone, over 2 million children were affected by emergencies around the world, whether that's from cyclones, from earthquakes, from floods as we've seen in Bangladesh, from droughts, from protracted conflicts. There's a range of different kinds of emergencies. They all affect children quite profoundly. We know a lot of work is being done to coordinate the response. The Global Education Cluster has been set up. They're in action currently live in 31 countries around the world, whether that's natural disaster or complex emergencies, and that UNICEF and Save the Children have been working together to help to lead that cluster coordination. We have people in the room today who have been very actively involved in that. However, we know that coordination alone does not bring a response. What brings a response is actually a response and the money that goes with it to fund it. And I regret to say that funding for education emergencies has been downright dire. Between 2006 and 2009, education needs as expressed in the various consolidated appeals and other emergency appeals represented 4.2% of emergency needs, but received only 2.3% of the funding available. To put that in dollar terms, education funding requirements in 2009 were $463 million, and they received only $145 million, 31% of the articulated need, while overall 71% of humanitarian need was funded. We realize we don't get everything we ask for as humanitarians, but education is falling far behind what other aspects require. John Holmes, the outgoing emergency relief coordinator, stated in his funding review in 2010, and I'll quote, "The education cluster is vital in promoting security for children, stability, and a sense of normality in emergencies and post-conflict settings, that this cluster is chronically underfunded. In Pakistan, around 30,000 children are in camps. Host communities in areas of return will be affected if the 12% funding level is not improved. Kenya will suffer a further decrease in enrollment rates for schools in drought-stricken north if funding isn't mobilized. So far this year, education and projects in Kenya have reported zero funding." So clearly our global humanitarian coordinator thought this was important enough to highlight in his funding review and is calling on the world to do something about it. So 5 points on why education should be included in humanitarian response. First, education is essential for children's recovery from an emergency. It's a fundamental right. It's a fundamental aspect of children's lives. It's a Millennium Development Goal. It's what we know is a part of children's lives, and we understand the profound impact what happens to children when their normal lives and their education is disrupted. I won't dwell on that. I think that bit is self-evident. It's how we go about it. Secondly, education is what children request. We say we're accountable to beneficiaries. We say that's what we do. We say we ask children and their families what's important to them. And in emergency responses, not just in day-to-day life, families and children articulate the importance of education, the importance of being in school. The humanitarian community works to humanitarian principles, accountability to beneficiaries being central to that. And if that's what the beneficiaries are telling us is important, I think we should be listening. In Haiti, our education program manager talked about the role that education emergency provides transition towards structured learning through provisional play, safe play areas, getting children together provides protection, but also provides learning opportunities and safe spaces. Children and parents are asking for that now as part of the humanitarian response. They've been asking for that for the last 6 months. The provision has not been adequate. In Cyclone Nargis, Susu Sande, who's 12, who was forced to stay in a religious hall for shelter, said, "I also feel so sad to see that my school was totally destroyed. School should start soon, and I'm worried that we won't be able to attend school in time. I want my house and my school rebuilt." And just a couple voices of people who, in the moment, recognize that their education, their schooling, their sense of normality is essential to their recovery from an emergency. Thirdly, we say that an emergency response should be about restoring essential services that have been disrupted by a crisis. If, in fact, education has been disrupted, as it is in virtually every single crisis that we know of, then that has to be part of our collective effort to restore and rebuild a community, and in fact, wherever possible, to build it back better. When access to education fails to be quickly provided, we know that many quite horrible things can happen. Children are drawn into taking on adult roles and responsibilities when they're not in a place that works for children. Many children may never return to school again if their education is disrupted through a protracted crisis, and that opportunity is lost. Potentially a generation is lost. And we know also that education services can deteriorate as the effort is given to other areas, and often not to recover effectively. These can have fundamental long-term impacts. And so a short-term emergency or protracted crisis, if not looked at, will have impacts beyond the duration of that emergency if education isn't taken into account. Fourthly, education can be an enabler of other emergency sectors. We know that things are going on. We know that we're trying to provide in an emergency a range of responses. We talk about integrated responses. But how is it that we can then use education as a way of ensuring that we're getting the other things done? We know, in particular, in a sudden onset emergencies, adults have other things to do. Whether that's helping to find basic, food and shelter for their families, whether that's work opportunities that might present themselves even in the midst of an emergency response, particularly when some of that response might be a cash for work or a food for work scheme. Adults have other things that they need to be doing. By having a safe, secure place for children to be, that is also giving them an opportunity to learn and provide some sense of normality. Parents can go, and other adult members of a household can go about their business, their urgent business, and that makes a more effective response. We know that aspects of health, of nutrition, of water and sanitation can be provided through schools, and the schools can be an effective way to get certain aspects of an emergency response provided, and it does also provide something that a community recognizes as central to what they need to do. We know that it can be an important part of information dissemination, taking care, basic messages, health and hygiene, and other key messages. And we know that safe play areas in schools can provide essential protection for children in the midst of emergency. And finally, we know that disaster risk reduction is an essential part of any emergency response. It should happen beforehand, but we know that during an emergency, it is a great opportunity to provide and build in disaster risk reduction. Schools can provide a critical part of disseminating that information, of reflecting on the causes of emergencies and building in prevention later. So those are just a handful of reasons why education in emergencies is essential to an integrated and appropriate humanitarian response, why it's essential for children, why I say that children thinks it's a critical part of the work we want to be about. And so I would hope that with these arguments and the other stories told today about what can happen in a place like Bangladesh when government and NGOs and others get together, that we can quickly move in short order from making education in emergencies second nature to our response and to ensure that education in emergencies is fully funded. Thanks.
Thank you, Greg.